name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of this book, among others, Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. I've written several books about the topic, and this was my first one, published 20 years ago, 18 to be precise, 18 years ago, Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. So I'm kind of the granddaddy of the field, so to speak. Malignant Self-Love started as a series of correspondences with mainly victims of narcissistic abuse, but also with some narcissists and therapists working with narcissists who found themselves utterly befuddled and bemused by the condition. And so this correspondence was going on for 2 years. And then I discovered patterns in the correspondence. I discovered that there were frequently asked questions. So I collected these questions together and I opened a website in 1997. And then people put pressure and asked for the website to be published as a book. Those were the olden times. And people still prefer to read physical books. So there was the first edition of Malignant Self-Love, published in Prague in 1999. And it was an amalgamation and a collection of the concerns, hopes, fears of people who lived with narcissists, worked with narcissists, and suffered the inevitable abuse at the hands of narcissists. My book is a user's manual for the narcissist. When one buys a new computer, one usually refers to the user's manual, or the computer is rendered unusable. It's the same with the narcissist. When one gets married to a narcissist, when one starts to work with a narcissist, when one is employed by a narcissist, when one's clergyman is a narcissist, when one's, in law enforcement, in the courts, in show business, and in politics, of course, etc., etc. Narcissism is an all-pervasive phenomenon which permeates literally every major profession and every major field of life. So there's narcissism in the family, narcissism in the workplace, narcissism in religion, narcissism in politics, etc., etc. So this is a user's manual. Simply, it dissects and then describes the narcissist's psyche. What makes him tick? Which psychodynamic processes take place? How they interact with each other? How do they feed upon each other? The narcissist's unusual, peculiar, idiosyncratic, and very baffling reactions, including, for example, narcissistic rage, or devaluation, or idealization. These are things so outside the sphere of common experiences that one might as well be interacting or working with or living with an alien, an extraterrestrial being, or a form of artificial intelligence. In the absence of such a manual, it is impossible to decipher, decrypt the narcissist. It's impossible to predict the narcissist's next moves. It's impossible to shield oneself emotionally from the hurt and pain and agony that narcissists inflict on people. So my book is simply a shield. It's kind of like in Star Wars, it's a shield, because narcissists keep pelting people with all forms of maltreatment and so on. And this book is your protective wall, your firewall against the narcissist. Every human being has healthy narcissism. Healthy narcissism is a phase, usually in early childhood, and then there's a second phase in adolescence, where one usually forms one's identity and then acquires a modicum of self-esteem and self-confidence, which, if realistic, constitute a sense of self-worth. So one becomes aware of one's limitations, one's realistic talents and skills, one's abilities and disabilities, one's failings and one's advantages. And this put together, this is the edifice of healthy narcissism. Obviously, in the absence of healthy narcissism, people develop other forms of pathologies. For example, dependence or codependence. So healthy narcissism is critical. It is when healthy narcissism spins out of control, when it acquires a malignant form, when it remains puerile or even infantile, when it is commingled with primitive defense mechanisms, when it impacts one's ability to assess reality properly, in other words, what we call a failed reality test, when it generates and fosters and engenders cognitive distortions and cognitive biases and cognitive failures, when it leads to the suppression of emotions and inaccessibility of emotions, when it gives rise to extremely negative and destructive and then self-destructive emotions such as pathological envy and hatred. When all these are put together, then we have pathological narcissism. Pathological narcissism is not an extreme or radical form of healthy narcissism. It is an absolutely different clinical entity. It is so different to healthy narcissism that one would do well to think of it as an entirely different psychodynamic phenomenon. And this is why we need books like Malignant Self-Love and others, which describe this phenomenon, because it's really, really, as I said, so outside common human experience. I was literally the first to study to start with the field. But there's still, of course, an enormous amount of work to be done. And I think knowledge of pathological narcissism, narcissism in general, healthy narcissism, and the various manifestations and phases of narcissism is still in its infancy. And additionally, there is very strong resistance to studying narcissism. There is resistance among mental health professionals, many of whom are narcissists. There is resistance in the media and show business, where narcissism prevails. There is resistance among politicians, many of whom again are narcissists. And therefore there is a problem with budgets, research budgets and so on, which are determined ultimately by politicians, and so on and so forth. Narcissists hold many positions of power. Narcissists hold the levers of power, and they hold the purse strings. So it's an uphill battle to study narcissism against well-established constituencies of narcissists in extremely well-positioned nexuses. Yes, Trump is an example of a narcissist who made it. The more successful narcissists are, the more they become role models. I mean, why wouldn't you want to be Donald Trump? He has the girl, he has the jet, he has the presidency, he has property, he has the billions, he has, why he has media exposure. Give me one good reason not to be Donald Trump. Indeed, last year, the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, in its magazine, The New Scientist, published a cover story calling upon parents to teach their children to be narcissists. I'm kidding you not. Because narcissism is an adaptation. As civilization, especially Western civilization, becomes more and more narcissistic, as narcissistic values, behaviors and traits are rewarded, the incentive not to be a narcissist declines, and the incentive to be a narcissist increases. So modern society incentivizes people to be narcissists. Narcissism is a clinical entity, so one can have narcissistic behaviors and display narcissistic traits and not be a narcissist. But as more and more people behave narcissistically, as they lack empathy, as they become more ruthless and ambitious, as they trample upon others, as they engage in ostentatious consumption, as they emphasize materialistic values over spiritual ones, and so on and so forth, as these phenomena proliferate and take over modern discourse and modern society, then obviously more and more people, especially among the young, will tend to regard narcissism as a legitimate form of conduct, and actually as a currency, a social currency, and a great adaptation. And the horrifying thing is they would be right to think so. There have been quite a few studies recently by the likes of Twenge, Campbell and others that have demonstrated that narcissism is increasing among college students and so on. Although now Twenge and Campbell are reversing their position. I wonder why, but it seems that narcissism is increasing. And not only increasing, but as I said, being legitimized. For example, we recently have studies of so-called high-functioning narcissists. We have studies of productive narcissists. So narcissism is being, pathological narcissism is being attached to very positive adjectives high-functioning, productive, contributing narcissists and so on. So, are we about to be taken over by narcissists? I think yes. I think we will end up being led by narcissists, dictated to by narcissists. The bon ton will be narcissistic. Materialistic values are already prevalent, where they never existed before. Russia is an example. And empathy is, I think, not only on the decline, but is becoming an extinct commodity because it's not working. Empathy is not working. Empathy consumes energy, consumes resources. To be empathic, one needs to invest, one needs to reallocate scarce resources. And what does one get for that? Knife in the back, in the best case. So empathy loses its appeal as an adaptive strategy. It's all about survival, all about adaptation, all about the next generation. And in a world as harsh and merciless as ours has become, empathy is a very bad strategy. And narcissism is fast becoming an excellent strategy. I think we're putting the cart before the proverbial horse. I think technology reflects prevailing mores and social developments. I think narcissism was on the rise and technology only catered to this need. People wanted selfies, so they got selfies. It's not that technology made them take selfies, but they wanted a technology which would enable them to take selfies, which would empower them, which would allow them to publish texts, inane and less inane, which would let them broadcast or narrowcast, which would buttress their ego and so on. So I think technology is one step behind, actually. I don't think it creates these social phenomena, I think it reflects them. And then, of course, enhances them to good effect, good commercial and profitable effect. But who are the people who created the technology? Have a look, have a specific look at, for example, Stephen Jobs. I mean, a prime, probably sociopathic narcissist. So narcissists use technology to enhance or amplify the narcissism, which in turn allows them to create additional technologies to amplify the narcissism, and so on and so forth. So it's a feedback loop. Technology is not an instrument that, in my view at least, is not an instrument that alters the fundamentals of society, but it's an instrument that kind of cements these fundamentals and renders them socially acceptable, renders them widespread. And I think social media has done exactly this. I was formally diagnosed twice, once in the 80s and once in the 90s, by two psychologists, diagnosticians. So I'm pretty certain that I have it. I was never officially diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which is the closest approximation to psychopathy that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual has. Though I did participate in a documentary about me and my brain that implied that I might have psychopathy. Still, I have been diagnosed officially with narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder, the prevailing thinking, the thinking right now is that it's the outcome of environment rather than, nurture rather than nature. It is supposed to be the outcome of abuse in early childhood. Now, there are many forms of abuse. Abuse is any situation where the child's emergent boundaries, where the child's emergent identity, when they're threatened by the parents or other caregivers or even role models or in extreme cases peers. So when we say that boundaries and emergent identity are threatened, that enlarges the scope of abuse much more than most people think. So if you ask people on the street what is abuse, they would say, well, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And that is all true, because physical abuse, beating, sexual abuse, do threaten the boundaries of the child and hamper the child's ability to create a coherent, functioning identity. That's all very true. But also spoiling the child, pampering the child, placing the child on a pedestal, treating the child as an extension of the parent, forcing the child to fulfill the parents' frustrated ambitions and frustrated wishes. All